Um, yeah, so let's check that there. So I'm Lachlan. I work at Huntfish. I've been there with hunting and fishing for 8 years this year, I think it is. So I started out at the down the road when we were at the old store, getting ready to move up to our nice new premises, and which isn't so new anymore, and have been there since. I sort of have a bit of a passion for this stuff. Pretty much the moment my old man, who's fished his entire life as well, could get a rod in my hand, who has protege on the way. So so basically he got me into the conventional tackle almost straight away, and then I was 7 years old when I raided dad's shed and took my first fly rod out, and so taught myself for a good little bit before he realised, no, he's actually pretty keen on this and he wants to learn. So he showed me a good portion of what I knew, and from then I've just kept experimenting. And the more people you meet in this industry and this community, you start to pick up new techniques and different bits and pieces. And a good friend of mine, Corbus Loader, and myself started a couple of seasons ago experimenting with these things. So basically big streamers, which when you hold this up to a lot of people and they see a giant articulated bit of fluff with googly eyes, kind of go, there's no way that's going to catch trout. But what we've found is the complete opposite. We started fishing them probably about 4 or 5 seasons ago, and it's not really till the last couple of seasons that we've sort of refined what we do and figured out how effective it works. For us, it started like probably a lot of people's journey in terms of streamer fishing. Started down Tongariro with the 2-handers and the spey, and it sort of took off obviously a few years ago, and everyone was running different bits and pieces of the spey stuff, and we both sucked at it is what basically started it. And so what we started doing instead is we stumbled across a guy who many of you will know, Kelly Gallop. So he's slide in over in America. He's got his own YouTube channel there, and pretty much what I'm going to talk about there today. He's the original pioneer, as per se, for this style of fishing, along with a few other guys, which they're based out of the Ozarks. And what's cool about that is their rivers and their streams in that part of America are actually very similar to a lot of the water that we have here in the Waikato specifically. Waikato River being one of them itself. There's a good bit of fishing to be had on an afternoon, just walking down the walkway down the side, and myself and Ivy are trying to figure out a little bit from the boat as well. So basically what they started doing in this style of fishing is, rather than casting across your stream as you normally would with a nice heavy sinking line and swinging these flies down across the bottom of the water, what they started doing is they started fishing their streamers upstream and stripping back towards them, very much like what you would do with your spinners. Basically, they all come from a conventional gear background, and that's what they just basically imitated what they knew with the conventional gear and translated it across to fly fishing. And at first they had some success, but it didn't seem to outfish sort of learning how to properly swing back and across, until they started making these flies which push a ton of water and also create vibration and have huge size. So that's kind of these flies here. So articulated flies. So there's a couple of different patterns. The most famous of which being Kelly Gallop's Sex Dungeon, which is an interesting name, but he named it, not myself. So we'll go from there. But these flies, they all work on the same principle. They're a giant deer hair head or a series of articulations. I know some of you guys were part of the fly tying nights, and Dave Smith, he tied for one of those nights, I believe, a game changer with you guys. So that's the kind of fly that applies to this style of fishing. So these flies, they work, and it's interesting that you have a fly tester, because this is one of those flies that you really want to pop into one of those, and have a look and have a watch of how they actually swim. Because what happens is, as the water pushes down onto them, or as you're stripping your streamer back towards you, this head here is causing drag, and it's causing this articulation on the back of it to swing like crazy. So these flies, as you twitch them through the water and you move them basically back towards yourself, they move a hell of a lot of water. And obviously, the bigger the fly, the more water you're going to move, and the more fish you move too. So basically, when it comes to setup and gear, the cool thing with it is most of you already have the setup for it. You don't need anything really, really fancy. If you've got a floating line, a 6-weight, or even below, a Euro rod even, as I'll talk about in a second, you've got the gear for it. So it's sort of one of those techniques that, especially as we come into a new season, that you can go sort of pack up a few flies and go out there basically and fish them. What we have found is there is a few things that we've sort of refined and changed and mixed up, which are different to what they do over in America, and it's just sort of we've tailored them and suited them a little bit to our New Zealand conditions. We're blessed obviously over here with numerous numbers of rainbows throughout the Waikato, as well as browns in different fisheries. And what we found is when you are fishing those different fisheries, you tend to find slight differences with how you sort of target those fish. But yeah, it's an awesome technique, and it's sort of one of those things that as you experiment more with it, it sort of is a bit of a deep dive, and you end up finding yourself throwing something like this, a ridiculous sized thing on, for example, Canny Whaiwha, and up the very top end there where it's skinny water and there's barely any. You wouldn't think that you'd move any fish in a river that size with a streamer that is actually half the size of the fish that you might likely to pull out, but it's great fun. Has anyone actually fished these big streamers before, or is it sort of new to most of yourselves?
Use them for trolling for tuna.
Trolling for tuna? Yeah. There's the original patterns were actually all based around saltwater patterns. So they basically borrowed ideas from the saltwater patterns. For example, the pattern that you showed me earlier with the big articulation there is actually a very, very similar pattern to something else that I'll show you later in a second. But in terms of fishing the big streamers, the rule of thumb and what we sort of have found, at least for local Waikato rivers, is when you start out, you tend to fish these guys upstream, where we're making short, snappy casts. So I'll got a little breakdown of a pool up on the Mangataki, which I'll run you guys through in a second. We'll get you up and around here and we can kick all this stuff off. But you're making your casts upstream. So basically you'd make your cast upstream into the pool, and then you're either dropping that tip down and stripping back with serious aggression. We're not putting any sort of hesitation into it. The second the fly hits the water, it's probably the most important thing with these big flies. If you even leave a little bit of slack, you're going to find that your fly's already halfway down, because you're casting upstream into the current. Especially when you're casting into the very top end of a pool, you need to make sure as soon as your cast hits the water, you're stripping. So even to the point where what we've figured is that first, when it hits the water, if you drop that backhand back to allow you to basically, as soon as that fly's in the water, drop that backhand back to cover the slack, and then you're stripping basically. We're making, always look where you're casting, but yeah, there's in terms of I should grab this one. In terms of rods and line, the one of the things that we have found as well, which does help, and this is one thing that might be worth looking into if you want to do this a lot. And all these fly lines here have similar features on them. One thing that does help immensely, specifically for maintaining contact and seeing how your line is sitting when it hits the water, is having these real bright fly lines. So for myself, I fish or have been fishing for the last season and a half a Scientific Angler's Anadros. So it's bright orange on the very front section of it. It's and it seems a bit odd at first because you're used to, particularly with a lot of our small streams around the local area, you're used to fishing, stealthy olive coloured fly line and trying to be as unimpactful as you possibly can. But what we've found is, and it's almost true to a point that we've actually even watched it happen, where the fish almost get as excited by the big flies as they do this bright orange fly line slapping down in the water. And we've had it multiple times now where on a couple of the streams around here, one of them being the Mangataki, which we'll talk about later, we've actually had a fly snap off, but we've still been able to move fish just by, once we've got them excited with a few casts over top of them, just by stripping back the fly line. So it's I don't think it's necessarily what we'd call a subtle technique. Subtlety isn't necessarily going to be your first step. So what we quite often do, and this is where I would use this technique, is sort of in part where I might fish up a stretch of river, and I might not touch anything, but I might have seen fish, might have put them down even with the nymph or the dry fly or whatnot. I'm going to come back guns blazing. I'm going to come back with the complete opposite way around of how I've approached it in the first half, and I'm going to throw something real big and ugly. What you'll notice when you start fishing these flies is there's a term we basically use, which is called moving fish. So you move a lot of fish. You don't necessarily get a ton of hookups straight away, which can be very frustrating in a way. So it's still pretty exhilarating the first couple of times you see it in a day. Watching a fish suddenly turn out of a pocket and chase this big streamer back and have multiple cracks at it can be really exciting. But it is something where you'll quite often have fish move. So you make a cast into a pocket, start stripping back towards yourself. This fish turns, it starts to follow, or it comes up off the bottom and you see it swirl on your streamer, and then it goes back down. You make another cast, the exact same thing happens. You make another cast, and then third time, hopefully the charm, you're in. If that doesn't happen, that's when I sort of switch things back to a little bit more of a traditional sense, where we probably are going to drop down to something small, like so a little woolly bugger. But rather than, and I don't like doing this to start with because it does kill the action of the fly. So the articulation works by basically there being drag on the front of the fly. So the more drag you put out the back of the fly, the less action the fly is going to have, which is a big part of it. But what I do, and this is a pattern, so this is actually based around the same principle as your one that your mate has. It's another Kelly Gallup pattern. It's a laser legal. So it's one of my own ties. This isn't a commercial one, but most of the flies I'll show you are commercial, but these are slightly different. This is how I tie mine is I use these articulated shanks. So that's a big part of how many of you tie out of interest. Is that a good portion of it? yeah, I might talk to. I don't know if you guys how you run the tying night now. I know it used to be slightly different. Now that Dave's come along, it's a bit different. But if you guys are interested, I'm more than happy to show you how to tie some of these and the way I tie these particular ones. But I run these particular articulation shanks because it allows me to put a little loop basically directly off the back of the fly, which I can then run basically a section of small leader out to what you'd be a little bit more familiar with. So a little woolly bugger or even a nymph in some cases. If you've got a little like CDC collared nymph can work really well on some of the smaller streams. And all it is it's basically a fish that's spent that amount of energy coming up to have a crack at something is always going to have a look around. If it's come and it's come right up off the bottom, and it's come right up halfway across the stream, as a rule of thumb, most of the time, even if they swirl on your fly, they stop for a second before they tend to give up, basically. And what you find is quite often, if you tie this off to the back, basically sort of 30 to 40-ish centimeters behind the fly, you get another strip basically where you're putting another form of food basically that's maybe perhaps a little bit more manageable, a little bit more something that they're familiar with in their stream. Because most of the time they're hitting these out of aggression, not necessarily chasing them for food. I mean, absolutely trout will eat big patterns like this. I mean, if you open up most fish, you'll see in the stomach there is little bullies, there is little thing, and we've got evidence of trout where they've eaten other trout, so they're definitely willing to eat something like that if the opportunity arises. But most of the time, it's an aggression thing. It's they're hitting these flies because of the fact that another fish has come into its territory and into its zone, and it's basically trying to chase it out. So the hits can be quite aggressive, and that's why we tend to, as a rule of thumb, run 2 hooks on the flies, ideally, unless you're trailing a fly behind it. That's where I'll switch over to something where I can tie it off the back of the fly specifically. You can tie it off the bend of the hook, but it kills the action even more. So I try to fish these ones now, which I've had better luck, where it still has the darting action and you still get the full movement of the articulation as you pull it along. If you're using nice supple mono, so SA or pretty much most of the brands on the market nowadays have some form of supple mono, but the fly will still have enough action through it as you strip it back towards you. That having a little fly off the back doesn't kill it as long as it's in line with the fly in front of it. And in terms of sinking the flies, so obviously deer hair floats. So these flies, by having a giant deer hair head on them, aren't inherently super heavy. So what they do on the flies, as a rule of thumb, they tend to put big lead dumbbell eyes on the front, but even then, that's not going to completely counter all of the extra buoyancy that you gain. Some of these flies, actually, some guys use rather than using deer hair, they're using foam now. So they're using what they call fettuccine foam, which is basically just strips of foam tied in the same way that you pack a deer hair head. The whole point is to push as much water as possible, so you're trying to create a big surface area effectively. But the flies themselves aren't, like, they are heavy. Like, if Carl, if you want to pass that around, I'll give you an idea of how heavy they are. But they're not so heavy that they're going to sit right in that bite zone, especially if we're casting upstream, because current's going to pick up from underneath, and it's going to push those flies up. The issue that you have with a lot of these flies is in terms of size, and I've sent Carl a video which I'll get him to share to the club so that you can have a look. It is showing dry flies and nymphs, but the same principle still applies here. When you have such a big fly with big proportions like that, the water's going to get underneath it and it's going to slow its descent. So what you find is sometimes in really, really fast current, you need to, even though we are trying to fish big flies, we want something. This is one of my favourite little patterns for that style fishing, and using the Euro rigs as well, which is your small and heavy with not a ton to it, because you just want to cut down through the water. That you want as little volume as possible. So something like that, where you can basically just force it down through the water in a really, really fast water, is sometimes a little bit more of an appropriate thing. But these big streamers and sort of moderate to high flows will still get down as long as we use an appropriate leader. So the fly lines that we're using tend to be floating, although there are some fly lines now that are on the market which are, for example, Rio do a Predator, which is basically the very, very front section of the fly line is an intermediate. So it basically acts as what this is. Or like Airflow's doing on, it's pretty cool. It's called Streamer Max, which this particular, if you let it sink and you let it in completely calm, still water sink, it would sink at a rate of about 1.5 to 3-ish inches per second, depending on what fly you have on the front of it. But what it does in particular is it takes on the inherent, it basically takes on the action in the front loading section of the fly line as to what you put in, basically the leader that you put on front of it. So if you're using up to about an 80 grain leader and you're putting it onto the front of this fly line, what it's going to do is it's actually going to cut down through the water at about less 1 inch per second than what your leader that you're putting on. So if I'm running for example, this one here in my hand is a Rio 7 inch per second. So I'm going to be able to cut down hopefully through the water at a rate of about 6 inches per second. There's, depending on how long and how heavy your leader is, that can change. Like I personally like the Rio ones because they sit at about 7 feet instead of 10 feet. I find that sometimes the 10 feet action seems to be a little bit too long. The Airflow do a little 5 foot one as well, which can be really good in really, really fast little tight pockets. Not necessarily deep water because you sort of run out of the length, unfortunately, but for that sort of water, a sort of a 7 foot leader down into, I usually tie on a tippet ring. It's just a helpful little bit. I put them on all of my own personal leaders, but you can just tie directly off to the leader. Just saves you cutting it back later. And down to a very short section of tippet. So running basically about 40 centimeters to a meter. And what that does is this line's going to get down through the water column. And because we're stripping, obviously every time we strip the fly line, it is going to pull back up through the water column. So it's basically making sure that weight is there to come back down as quickly as we possibly can to put that fly into a darting action. So we want that fly to basically dart as much as possible. And with the water being pushed, the action basically becomes quite a side-to-side kick, basically, and you actually watch the fly roll, basically. So it does rather than doing a dart up and down, it's if you're fishing right and you've got the right weights and the right setup, ideally for the water, your fly will actually roll like that. So it will basically roll up and then it will kick back down to the side as the water pushes it down on the angle that it finds itself. And then really so that's the basic premise for getting the flies into it, and then when you sort of get to the little bit more, I guess, geeky side of things, is what we found is as we got into this more and more, we started finding stuff that for us seemed to work a little bit better. So leaders, that side of things, we tailor them to the water that you need. So I always carry with me a good range. So I carry right from a hover right through to a 7-inch per second, and even they make them more for spay, but right down to a 14-inch T-flow tip, which will just absolutely cut down through that real fast water when you need it to. And if you really find yourself in a tough spot, you can use split shot, but I try to avoid it because you do kill and you do deafen that thing. As we got more technical and more into it, we started to find that on certain areas that bigger isn't always better sometimes. And whilst it is fun to go throw a nice big bit of fluff at fish, sometimes dropping that, especially for New Zealand conditions, and this is what we found is the browns tend to have they obviously have a higher predator drive, and they tend to have no issue nailing these big flies. But in some of our streams, especially stuff back further down towards sort of in the King Country area, which is sort of where I grew up, so they're quite precious to me. But we found that sizing down one size does help a little bit. So we went to so this one is I think they market it as a 6, but it's actually tied on a size 4 hook rather than a size 6. So I don't know what the story is there, but it's one size down. It's going to be that sort of size fly there is going to allow you to fish some of that water that's a little bit smaller, and allows you to sort of target some of those fish which may or may not shy off a big streamer. Not to say that you can't throw this. So like I've thrown this, and one of my favourite streams for this technique is I've mentioned it already, but the Mungataki down by Piu Piu there. It's one of those streams where you can go up it on a day and you can fish however you want. But if you do run these big streamers, what you'll find is sort of I use the smaller flies as a bit of a confidence builder, because I'll start my day in that sort of 6 to 4 range in terms of flies, and I'll fish those still articulated to see how the water is fishing, and I'll get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you sort of find that stopping point. And what we found is sometimes you have fish that you can be fishing these things that are absolutely big. They're basically some of the guys have done any still water stuff over in England, or have seen any lock stuff up called snakes, basically, which are these big long strips of rabbit, basically, that are the full strip of rabbit, basically, with another hook tied off the back, and basically a set of dumbbell eyes, and that's all the fly really is. But you'll have fish that will happily hit that sometimes on some days where you've got these big long, basically effectively as an eel, more or less, basically throwing on small water. So it sort of allows you to try and do different bits and pieces there. In terms of the game changes, and one point, since I know some of you guys do have them in your kit, the one thing that is worth mentioning with these things versus a single point of articulation is if you are going to fish them, I do like game changers. I think they're an awesome pattern. They've got the most action out of anything, obviously, for good point measure, because of the amount of articulation they get through them. But what you will find is when fish tend to have a crack at these, they tend to have a crack at the head rather than the tail. As a rule of thumb, it's not always true. There's always a hook on the back side of the fly, but because it's a take that's usually out of aggression rather than out of sort of your hunger drive necessarily. What we've found is most of the fish tend to either hit the fly in the very middle of the fly, and that front hook finds home because of the line basically pulling as the fly bends, or they they hit the very head of the fly. They'll actually grab it, bite down, and that back of the fly, you can actually see it sometimes, is actually sticking completely out of their mouth. And so if you are going to buy the commercial game changers, which there is unfortunately only a few companies that do them, and they usually go in batches very, very quickly, but a lot of them are tied without a front hook. They've only got a back hook. So just be a little bit careful when you do look for them from the commercial stuff. Manic does one which I don't actually stock because they basically don't have a front hook on it. So it's a good pattern, but it's just one of those things where that is something, if you tie them yourselves, you really want that front hook just from that aggression and that prey drive. Yeah, I've got a little selection of flies which I'll stick those all back in there. The dungeons do go as small as these little things. What these are actually intended for, and more so than fishing in streams, these are actually more intended for fishing as a muddler, basically, as a muddler minnow, which is more of a still water pattern. And what they do is, and what I recommend doing, especially at a fly that size, is I'd cut the back hook off completely. What tends to happen when a fly is that small and it's got two hooks on it, and the worst possible thing that can happen is fish comes in from the sides, it grabs it, gets the bottom hook stuck, that back hook is free and it's moving around, it ends up in the top jaw, then your fish is basically pulling that fly from two different pressure points. And what's going to happen is the bottom hook's going to pop out, and that top hook, which isn't probably going to be buried all that well, is going to basically pull. So you're going to lose both sides of it. So for something like that, I would sort of more fish it in the small stuff. With the articulation, I would fish more as a still water pattern, rather than a sort of stream and river pattern.
Whether it's a sinking fly, not a floating.
But yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah, it's this with the dumbbell eyes, it becomes quite neutral in terms of the action. So you'd be fishing that using a DI 3 or plus line as a rule of thumb in still water, which it still works. It's still a great pattern for that, but it is something just to be aware of in terms of fishing at that sort of size dungeon and streams and that kind of thing. You find that you're probably more than likely going to end up usually missing a few just from the size is a little bit too small. Basically, at that stage, you might as well just go to a big rabbit or something like that and fish with the action off the back with no hook out the back. As a rule of thumb, it's not always true, but there's an exception to every rule. We sort of think we know trout, but sometimes they throw us a curveball, and it's a bit different. But yeah, that is I'll leave those there. People are more than welcome to come have a look and have a browse through. The other side of it comes down to rods, so rod selection. So as I said, realistically, you can take any rod. Any rod will do. So a size sort of a 6 weight, 9 foot. Most people have one of those in their arsenal. If you do spin, believe it or not, they're actually heavy enough that you can launch one with a bit of split shot in front of it from a spin rod too, or a little cone head in front of it. So you can even fish them like that. Personally, I prefer to fish them with a fly because you get more action out of them. You're able to stop, you're able to pause, you're able to strip. So, but yeah, when we sort of started mucking around with it, we, especially on the smaller streams, what I tend to fish for myself personally is I now fish, my go-to is this little fella here. I own one of these personally, or this. So this is a little 9 foot 4 weight. This is a rod from TFO. It's blue ribbon. So the reason I fish this is when I'm fishing these, the other part of it is we're able to create some action with the rod itself. This is something that most of the time when we're fishing flies, we don't want to. We don't really want to be pulling the flies up off the bottom or twitching them with the rod. You're sort of taught when you're fly fishing to keep everything a bit rigid and or follow the drift and make sure that you maintain contact. Cool thing of these is because there's such a heavy point of contact on the other end, you're able to twitch the rod a little bit. So quite often at an end of a drift, if I've finished stripping in and I'm to myself to Nathan here away, I've probably only got one or two more strips left, but I've got all of the water from me to Nathan to fish. So what I quite often do is I'll twitch the rod back out to my side to basically actually move that fly through the next section of water. And the lighter the rod, the softer obviously it is, and the more action I can generate from that basically from that rod. This is another TFO as well. For to bring across because it is actually a rod that's designed specifically mostly for fishing these big streamers. So it has a carbon rod. It's recoil guides, which are basically designed for going in and out of boats. So that they bend basically, so they don't hopefully break ceramics out. And the other thing with this is you'll see there it's, once again, it's got an incredibly soft front section, and then this entire bottom section of the rod is stiff as, so that you can pick those big flies up, lift them up out of the water, make a quick snappy cast, and then work those flies back towards you. So that one from TFO is basically a rod that was designed for that purpose, fishing those big streamers. It's a great rod. I sort of personally prefer for our water down to more so in a 4 weight with the sort of the Blue Ribbon series, but they are good for some effect in terms of you keep contact with the fly the whole way through, but you're sort of fishing two different water columns. If you're in it, you're down at the bottom, whereas this tends to be sort of subsurface or mid column of the water more so.
It sounds like there's an actual time.
There is, it's pretty active, yeah.
Fluoro or mono?
Doesn't matter, whatever you have more confidence in. I use fluoro. Fluoro's downside is it rots, so as it gets older, it tends to break down in terms of strength. Or that's at least what we tend to find with stuff that's on the market here in New Zealand at the moment. Mono's a little less clear, obviously, but it's going to keep for longer. So I personally prefer fluoro because I'm going through it enough and quickly enough. Like that, it's going to be used before it starts to get brittle. But yeah, I don't think there's, to be completely honest with this technique, I don't think it matters that much. As long as you're confident, you're happy that what you're fishing is appropriate for the water that you're in. Yeah.
You barbless?
All my own ties are barbless. Well, I started tying, so I use tannic clips, and I tend to run those barbless, just from a point of view that I sort of started that a while ago, and I haven't had any real disadvantage to fishing barbless. As long as you maintain contact with your flies, you tend to be fine. But as all the commercial ones, if you're going to come buy them from the shop, everything's either tied on by Umpa, Montana Fly Company, or Manic. So they're all on barb hooks, every single one of them. You can crush the barbs if you want to fish barbless, but which I don't think you can do for competition anymore, can you?
I know.
Yeah, so if you want to do it for competition, you're going to have to tie your own extremist. If you want to fish barbless, you could still crush and file the barb, but it's all the commercial ones are tied on basically barb hooks.
What's my trouble with two hooks? That's what I was asking the question.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm going to be one or two saying.
Yeah, what you'll find is they tend to actually only hook up on one hook most of the time. The other hook will usually end up sitting flat against their face. So as long as you don't, when you get to the net, it doesn't throw it around too violently and it ends up in all sorts. That's why I use a rubber mesh net. It just tends to be a little bit better at stopping it from ending up in the net and ends up hopefully getting less tangled when it does end up in the net. But yeah, usually you'll find that one hook is in the corner of the mouth and it's flat against it, and the other hook is usually tucked against the cheek, flat. Sometimes it ends up on smaller fish behind the gill plate, but it won't be in the gill plate. It'll just be sort of tucked against it. So it's it doesn't usually end up too much in the way, which is good for your fingers and for the fish. So yeah.
Yeah, a few questions. Can you use if you're using two flies, can you use a dropper rig rather than trying a loop on this, or will that impede the action of the top?
Yeah, it does. We did try it a little bit when we first did it. What you'll find is particularly with articulated patterns rather than, it's absolutely if you're just fishing two small patterns like that, where you've got a dropper and then another fly coming off the back, that will sit okay, and it won't tend to get too hung up as long as you use a dropper where it's relatively short. If you use a really long dropper, what you get is lots of twisting around the main line, and then as the fish comes back, you get a few tangles. But yes, you can fish them, but with the articulated flies, you don't really want a dropper because of the darting side-to-side action. You're going to pick up that back tag line basically as it darts back across. Because it rolls down on an angle, and if that fly is lighter and smaller, the fly is going to be left up behind it. So it's as you pull that fly basically back down across, you end up crossing the line, and you end up in a bit of a mess. So.
Yeah, so other questions, do you use the strip jerk sort of Kelly technique when you're stripping?
Yep. Yeah, so you can absolutely strip jerk, mix it up basically.
I don't think there's one rule to how you retrieve it. I like to experiment when I'm on the water. Some days you make a cast, hits the water, fish comes across, and it's a real slow pull. Basically, make your cast, let it sink, and just basically maintain contact with the fly so that it's swimming but not going much faster than the current. Sometimes you need to be aggressive with it. You need to really strip it. You need to work the fly. You need to move the rod tip to create action. But it's sort of case by case a little bit. As a rule of thumb, dirtier the water is, the more action I tend to personally put into my flies. I don't know if that's sort of more superstition now at this point, or if it is something that seems to have had effect. But yeah, that tends to be how I break it down. Yeah.
And that makes sense, because the dirtier it is, the less they see it, and the more they feel it.
How far would you normally cast?
We'll talk about that when I pull that out. I'll show you how I break down the water. I've got the pool drawn up there, and I'll show you how exactly I will break down that cast. Because the answer to that is it depends a little bit. So yeah, I'll show you that in a second. But
that was my third question: is what sort of water are you looking for? You know, we always look for seams and feeding stations, rather than holding lies for territorial fish that are sitting there waiting to die.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, if people want to come up, I'll show you this. So this is basically the bridge pull on the Mangataki. So if you head to the Mangataki Reserve, yeah, I've got you there. You'll come across this pole. It's just below the bridge there.
Sounds like you are the ones giving up. It's an hour and 4
Sweet, awesome. So, this is the bridge up here. So your road, as you come down into this pole, basically, and you reserve your car parks up over here. You come back down and cross, and you'll see this this section of water basically here, where you basically have a bridge that goes across, and then nice big flow coming in. Now, so I've separated it into three sections is how I break the water down. So you have your shallow. In this case, it's a mud bottom and mud and gravel mix here on the bottom section here. And what you'll find is, even though a lot of your fish are sitting in this water, you don't necessarily see them because, particularly with this river, it quite often be quite coloured up. So my plan of attack for this river and this particular pool, as a rule of thumb, is there's a little fence access way just here. I come down here, and I'll come basically, and then I'll meet this at the bottom of the pool, or I'll come down this side. There's a little walkway which you can walk down for about 30 minutes, and then you work your way basically back up to here. This will be the last pool that you'd fish of the day, depending on how you approach it. But there is a number to call on that gate too. So when you get down there, you can call that number, and 80% of the time it's okay to go fish it. If it's not, he'll direct you upstream, which makes it a great place to fish for if you need somewhere. You've gone down to the Aokino and the Aokino is blowing out or not fishing, come up to Mangataki, and quite often you can find that it will be, because it's a lot steeper, it clears out a hell of a lot quicker. So, but yeah, how I'd approach this basically is, as I said, I've broken this into three sections. So basically, our dark blue here is where as your deep water, this is your basically what you call your prime water, where you're going to have your top likelihood of finding fish in this zone. That's sort of the classic. You rock up to the Tongariro and you head basically straight out across all of the shallow, straight out to find that nice big deep seam that's got a lot of fish in it. That's just sort of what you find. That's sort of that darker blue water there. There's two big boulders in that particular pool, and behind those two big boulders, obviously, and in front of it, you're going to create a depression. So there's a bit of a deeper pocket that sits around here as well. Then you sort of have your gravel flat, which is that transitional zone. As a rule of thumb, when I'm fishing a bit of water like that, I'm going to come out and I'm going to make my way to the bottom of the pool. And my very first cast, say I'm fishing, I'll grab the Euro because that's closest to me, and I'll make my cast. My first cast is literally, I unhook the fly, I sit it into the water, and I twitch it basically back towards me. Whether I need to lift the rod up or whether I need to go off to the side to do that, I'm not casting far at all. And the amount of times which I've done that, and I've just made 3 casts. I've made one upstream, twitched it back towards me. I've made one across the water, twitched it back downstream or upstream, depending on how the current's pushing the fly, and then one below, and then ended up in one of those 3 scenarios hooking a fish is surprisingly common. Just because particularly if you're stealthy enough to come down to that water and it is a little bit coloured up, what you'll find is fish will push into those soft shelves more often than not, and they're sitting there because they're still getting food. They can still come out and pick up food more and in good numbers most of the time, but they don't have to work as hard sitting there. And when you use one of these big streamers, you're sort of doing what their worst nightmare is. You're another fish coming into their little break zone, which they've basically reserved, and they don't want this other little fish to have a slice of it. So they're going to trout are very territorial, so they're going to chase basically that out, and they're going to usually do that by having a whack at it. The next cast I'm making is, and this is because this is an upstream technique. Unfortunately, if I'm starting here, the one disadvantage to this technique is that you kind of are treating everything that's across the river from you. This is effectively becomes kind of dead water. Your best thing to do is start at the very bottom of the rapid. So come up and fish into that water from the very, very bottom end where the tail out of the pool is. And that's where swinging does have an advantage. You can sort of fish that tail out a little bit better. I think this method does die a little bit as soon as your fly is pulling, unless it's really soft, shallow water, when you're trying to swing that fly back around, because what starts to happen is because those flies have so much drag and they are such big in profile and the line becomes tight, it starts to just lift up and it starts to come basically through the water column. So you can fish it, but it's sort of very, in this case, if I'm going to start here, my casts into this zone, basically back downstream, are going to be really, they're going to have to be quick, make a cast, really work that fly, and then I'm picking up that fly, making a slightly longer cast, work it, pick up another cast, add a little bit more length, work it. And that is true of if you're fishing your spinners too. If you're treating it like in that water there, that's what you want to do. You want to make your short cast, your long cast, your long cast. But then when it comes to upstream, so my first cast in this pool is almost always straight along the bank. So there's a nice big corner that basically comes off, and there's a nice big flat area through here. My first cast is almost always at that very point in the shallows. And I'm going to basically fan my casts out in a nice big arc. That way I've worked, once I'm happy that I've worked a nice big arc, I'm going to take a couple of steps up and I'm going to start fishing that next big arc. So rather than fishing it as a sort of short cast, is only really tends to be when I'm right, fish your feet first. And then once I get going, I'm really casting as far as I need to work that arc and work that water, but leave the water that I'm fishing basically ahead of me as undisturbed as I possibly can. So my cast length is realistically tied into how the pool sits, how the pool lies really. So in this case, I'd be making a cast up to here, up to the very point of it, and then I'm going to work back in an arc with the same rough cast distance back across. I'm going to come up probably to about here for my next cast it into this. You can't obviously cast over top of that water, but cast into basically behind where the shelf meets realistically in this sort of zone, and then work back across, and then just keep pushing my way up, trying to fish the shallow water first as much as I possibly can, then fishing my hot bite zones basically. In this case, there's two big boulders here, so I sort of threw this pool in as a good example, where you might have deeper sort of what's necessarily better water. I don't think there's such a thing because fish hold in the whole stream bed, but rather than worry about, I need to fish this first or I need to fish this shallow stuff, I always work my way up with this technique in an arc basically. So it doesn't matter if there's structure in the way, falling over tree or whatnot, I'll always fish in that sweeping motion, which means that I'm covering 100% the whole water with that technique. And then that means that, quite often I get excited when I see stuff like that, because it means that I've got one hot bite zone here, and then I've got another hot bite zone here, hopefully, which means ideally I'm going to end up with one fish here, one fish here, one fish here, one fish here. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, you feel pretty cool. And yeah, you basically work your way up. This pool in particular has a where it shallows out quite dramatically on the inside edge, and the water sort of actually pushes back down like so. This sort of pocket, I will put a few casts through there, but that's a good example of an area where it's real tight down on the bottom section of the river, I'm going to really focus a lot of effort in there. That upper section where you get those big comb outs, especially where that water comes in from sideways, I almost treat that as I'd almost half that, basically like so, and I'd almost treat that as the beginning of the next pool rather than include it in where your water starts to really spread out into a big fanned plait. I'd almost divide it in half basically and treat it as two different pools. Just from the point of view that, especially with this technique, it is going to be probably an area that I'll realistically, if I'm fishing this river, I usually stop about here and I'll re-rig to a nymph rig or something to start that next pull up, unless this has been really working all day and I know for a fact that if I head up to that next pull, I've got a good chance of nailing a big fish on the streamer in there. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Is sort of treat it as arcs, so you'd be it's pens. There we go, red, nice and bright. So treat it as basically an arc. My next point, start there. Let's come up to here. I'll be coming out. I'll be treating another nice big arc. Come up to maybe about here, be treating, and obviously you're going to have to put a bend in that arc, but a nice big arc like so.
So what sort of distance is between?
As a rule of thumb, I tend to treat it, I will treat it as a rod length for most of the time. It depends on, it does depend on how big a water we're fishing. If you are fishing somewhere like, for example, I have done this in the Blue Pool in Tongariro, your cast that you're going to be making are obviously a hell of a lot longer. So I'm probably going to take maybe 2 rod lengths in that case, just because otherwise you're going to be stuck fishing that water really, really, really thoroughly. Because you're covering the water with such a big sweep and you tend to be maintaining contact the whole way through, obviously by the time we're back from here to here, we're repeating some of the water already. So it does depend a little bit on the water that I'm fishing. But what you'll find is it's worthwhile doing that, especially on the smaller streams and on stuff, because you'll have a lot of fish that will probably, for example, this is a great area where you might have it happen. You might have been fishing, here, you've moved up to here, so you have actually put a few casts into the zone already, but you'll have a fish that was sitting here, he's turned, he's followed you out, and he's back into the zone here, but he might only hit around about here. So even though you've fished over it, it's sort of more about swimming that fly for a bit more to allow you to hopefully end up with a take. Yeah.
Do you fish like, you're sort of saying half an metre legal edge?
Yep.
Is that sort of everywhere, or?
Yep. So
you're not concerned about the fish seeing the line, then after some people?
when you're flying a ginormous streamer, you're already pretty you're going to disturb the water quite a bit. As
I mean, the traditional is
I'm not.
a rod length or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've got it. What I sort of treat it as, I treat this as part of the leader, even though it is technically coloured and it is as a rule of thumb, that is going to end up at about 9 foot. So that's what I'm gonna effectively treat it as. So that even though it is coloured up, it is they don't tend to focus on that too much when there's a giant meal, right, or another fish there right in front of their face. Basically, they're gonna focus on that usually. Yeah.
And just for clarity, Lachie, is this multiple strips of cast?
Yes, yeah. I'd be fanning. For example, we'll start this one. I've made my first cast there.
Yeah.
My next cast is going to be maybe another foot across, another foot across, come another foot across, another foot across, another foot across, and I'll then move up from there to that next zone. Roughly per section. I'm using it as a fan rather than using it as an individual. Yep. All good. Any other questions or anything? Feel free to, if something dawns in you later on, feel free to pop into the store and have a chat.
You reckon a brighter leader? Line.
Yeah, you better get in.
Yeah.
I've got a bright pink one, but it's an 8-weight.
Yeah. For this technique, we are sort of trying to excite them really. I have what it does is you're able to see the fly line nice and clearly, which isn't always easy in high glare, and B, you're able to, as I say, we've had cases where the fly line stripping on the surface is enough to get fish excited. So a bright fly line, don't be scared of them. Are really helpful for this sort of technique. Yeah.
So your line, the bright section into the sinking.
No, so I use an anadrós. Mine is actually full floating, as the fly line that I tend to use for this method.
So the floating tip you can always mark as a bit of euro.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can do that if you wanted to. That's another way of maintaining contact. It does work for you as well to do that. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, I would having a bright front section on the fly line, it does help you a little bit. Yeah.
So Lachie, we just wanted to thank you for coming in and speaking tonight. We just got a little gift for you.
Oh,
And,
thank you. You didn't have to.
Make your way into hunting and fishing when you see Lachie. Take your Hamilton Angler Club card with you.
Yes.
That you give 10% off in store.
Oh, bugger.
Yep.
Yep.
I've been buying stuff for months through with that.
Yeah, I didn't know you were remember that.